Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new sketchbook tour. It's been a while since I've made another one, so let's get right into it. This is Alrav from Quebec, Canada, the author and creator of Alcatraz the Protector / Alcatraz the Protector. As always, all my comic book stuff can be found on my Substack. The links are available in the description below or on my channel's page. And without any further delay, let's get right into it. So for today's particular topic, as always, I get to show off my various sketchbooks and the drawings that I made inside while talking about all sorts of random things at the same time. So for today's topic, I have a question for my viewers, and I'd like to know what you think about it. Do you think that DC and Marvel are still relevant? And I think that's a fair question to ask, because nowadays when people talk about the comic books, it tends to be centered around the manga and anime and stuff. And there is a difference between the way American comics are made compared to franco-belgian albums or manga, and that is that one reality that we sometimes talk about but a little less so is that a lot of these famous American characters and IPs and stuff, the Batman, the Spider-Man and the likes, the creators or co-creators of these characters have all been subjected to work for hire policies, in which everything they created tend to remain with the companies on which they were employed. And so because of that, there isn't the same sense of authorship with the American icons that you would see with European and Japanese creators, to name a few. And the one thing that happens is that in the last decade or so, the comic book scene in America, the American one, has become overly political, and there's been a lot of blaming and finger pointing, as well as a lot of divide between what the fans want and what the corporations, the editors and stuff they want. And so that's, I think, the main reason why I'm asking this, because from my perspective and stuff, I grew up with American comic books, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I started shifting away toward European and Japanese stuff, with a few exceptions. And the one thing that I do realize is that when you strip away the characters and the IPs from the authors, which is often the case with the American publishers and companies, it's like stripping away the soul or the essence of these particular characters, these creations, and you end up with incomplete toys and puppets that are then assigned to a never-ending slew of rotating writers and artists, and with diminishing returns over time, you end up with the characters that never age, grow, or evolve, that get trapped in these perpetual washing machine cycles with stories that never ends. And a lot of the issues with the American comics that can be seen nowadays, I think, can be attributed to these work for art policies that the publishers have been doing. And this authorship that I'm talking about is also what makes the comics from Europe and Japan so good, is because they tend to stay, first and foremost, it's a creator-owned medium in this environment. So when the characters and IPs are made, they tend to stay with the authors, and they rarely leave their ends unless, let's say, they decide to appoint a successor, which can happen. So there are many examples of that, but usually they tend to stick with the authors themselves, and it tends to be a good thing. So that's why the stories themselves, they tend to have a definitive conclusion unless the authors decide that yes, they want to do more. So in those instances, that's when you can have an exception. But that's also the root cause of a lot of the issues with American comics, and there are many examples of that. So a good example that I could come up with would be Spider-Man. I was a huge Spider-Man fan when I was a kid, and the one thing that happened with the character in particular, ever since One More Day came to be, that was my jumping off point for American comics, in the spirit at least, is that one thing that made Spider-Man such a great character and a never-enduring icon of the Americans is that, well, they were the everyman angle of the character that tend to appeal to people. That's one thing. But I think one thing that's less talked about with this particular character is that Spider-Man was one of the earliest precursors of the modern day shonen protagonist that you would see in manga and anime, in the sense that he did start it off as a teenager in high school and stuff, living in his aunt's attic, but he didn't stay there as a character. He would gradually evolve throughout the decades to pass away from high school to being in college, getting his first girlfriend or such, to then moving on to university, finding the love of his life in the form of Mary Jane, getting married, starting a proper job career, being on the verge of establishing a family unit, and even becoming a founding member of the New Avengers, with other street-level heroes such as Wolverine and Luke Cage, to name a few. And of course, there were a lot of bumps along the road because it is a corporate IP, but it was something amazing to see a character being able to evolve and grow so much, while most superheroes, they tend to stay relatively the same throughout the decades, with maybe a few exceptions, but it was something that made Spider-Man such a great character. It was the constant growth and evolution of the character. So when Marvel did the whole One More Day storyline, basically they sort of resetted the character to a factory default setting, which was basically the late 60s, early 70s. And since then the character has sort of been trapped in this perpetual washing machine cycle, and that's when you realize that as fans we love the growth and evolution that the character had, but the reality is that the closest thing to a proper authorship of the character was always in the hands of the co-creators Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And so when the latter left the character, that's when Spider-Man became a strictly corporate IP, and for a while we never noticed because we were still hooked on the character, but now in the last decade or so, that's when we started to realize the extent of the damage that all these work for policies and stuff that Americans did has done to the comics themselves. And that's sort of an example amongst many authors, where the characters, sometimes they will evolve and grow to a certain extent before someone else shows up and then decide to just reset the character to how they used to be at a certain point in time, and that's sort of part of the reality. That's the reason why I think that the only way to be able to enjoy the characters themselves is to let go and to focus more on the creator-owned properties instead, and the independent scene. And that's why I believe that the Europe and Japan stuff is better. That said, let me know what you think in the commentary section below, and we'll see one another very soon in the next video. So with that being said, thanks for watching, and we'll see one another very soon. Enjoy the video.